I'm excited to have Kate Clifford Larson here with us tonight to talk about her book, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter. Dr. Larson is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of 4 critically acclaimed biographies. Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, and The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. An award-winning consultant, Dr. Larson has worked on feature film scripts, documentaries, museum exhibits, and numerous public history initiatives, and has appeared on local, national, and international television, including CBS Sunday Morning. Larson holds 2 degrees from Simmons College, an MBA from Northeastern University, and a PhD from the University of New Hampshire. She is currently a Brandeis Women's Study Research Center visiting scholar and lives in Winchester, Massachusetts. There's going to be time after the program for questions. So if you have a question, type it in the chat. You can do it anytime during the program and we'll address the questions at the end. Kate has also graciously offered to sign books. So if you want a signed book, buy the book, bring it to the library. Bring it to the library by February 4th. Leave a bookmark in the book with your name and telephone number. Give it to the ladies at the front desk, and they will make sure that it gets to me, Marnie Smith. And if you have someone, whoever you want the book to be signed for an inscription, put that on the bookmark as well and make it clear that it's the inscription. And so have the books here by February 4th, and then Kate will come and sign them all, and I'll call and get them all back to you. So I'm excited for tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Marnie. It's exciting to be here, and thank you for accommodating this scheduling, and I'm excited to sign people's books if they want to have them signed. So tonight, I'm really excited to talk about Rosemary Kennedy because there's just something amazing about her and her legacy and how she has shaped our nation. And while her story has tragic elements to it, I think there's something very powerful about her life, and I hope you come away from this presentation feeling the same thing. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some PowerPoint images that I'm going to share with you as I give my talk, and then afterwards I will answer questions for you. So can you see this, Marnie?
No, not yet.
Okay, hang on. So I'm thinking I did not share. Hold on. Share screen. There we go. There. Now we can see it. Yes?
Yes.
Great. Perfect. Okay, Rosemary. This is a beautiful photograph of Rosemary. It was taken in Ireland in 1938, I believe, 39. And she's happy, full of joy. And this was one of the happiest times of her life. So I just love this photograph. So let me go on to the more of the story. Excuse me. So Rosemary was born in September of 1918. She was the 3rd child of Joe and Rose Kennedy. And here's beautiful pictures of Rose with her 3 children. They already had 2 boys, Joe Jr. and little Jack, who would go on to be our president. Joe was born in 1915, Jack in 1917, and then Rosemary arrived in 1918. And Joe and Rose lived in Brookline. He was an up-and-coming businessman, banker, And as you know, Rose was the daughter of the famous Massachusetts politician, mayor of Boston, Honey Fitzgerald. And they had a home in Brookline, Massachusetts. And when Rosemary was born, Rose was thrilled to have a daughter. She had sisters whom she loved very much. She had these two rambunctious boys at home, and to have a little daughter just seemed to complete their family. And Rose later wrote about Rosemary was a very good baby. She rarely cried. She wasn't fussy. She just seemed to be a happy, easy baby. And so as she aged through her infancy and going into toddlerhood, they noticed that Rosemary seemed to sit up much later than the boys did, crawled later than the boys did. She learned how to feed herself much later than the boys, to say words and walk and learn how to walk much later than the boys. And Rose and Joe attributed that to her being a girl. They assumed that boys were just more advanced than girls, so Rosemary was just slower. But they had Kathleen Kick, their next daughter, in 1920, and she developed just as quickly as the boys had done. And then Eunice was born in 1921, and Eunice just blew them all out of the water because she was very advanced. She's like crawling and starting to walk before she's a year old, and she's talking and she's a year old, and she's telling everybody what to do. She just was, a star even as a child. So they began to wonder what was going on with Rosemary. Here she is in pictures with Eunice and Kick. The picture on the left, there's Rosemary with her big smile. She just loved her sister so much. And then Kick is right behind her with Eunice. And then the photograph on the right is Rosemary with Eunice. And Eunice and Rosemary would become the closest over the years, and especially as teenagers and young adults, and eventually Eunice would be responsible for Rosemary's care, but they were very, very close. So they just had this beautiful life and happy childhood, but Rose and Joe were a little concerned about why Rosemary seemed to be developmentally delayed in some things. For instance, she couldn't figure out how to ride a tricycle or a bicycle. She couldn't figure out steering and pedaling at the same time. Here's this photograph on the left of Rosemary on a tricycle, and but she really couldn't maneuver it. She couldn't ride it. But I know Rosemary, and I just know in this photograph, she told whoever took the picture, I want my picture on that tricycle. So they put her on it, and she had her picture taken. The photograph on the right is Rosemary with her godfather, Eddie Moore. Eddie and Mary Moore were close family friends. Eddie Moore had worked with Honey Fitzgerald for years. And when Joe Kennedy started becoming more successful in business in Boston, Eddie started working for Joe sort of as his right-hand man, his assistant, secretary. He did lots of different things. Eddie and Mary did not have children of their own, and they just became like surrogate parents to all the Kennedy children. And the Kennedy children loved them, treated them like an aunt and uncle, and they were just very loving. But Eddie was Rosemary's godfather, and he doted on her. He would buy her beautiful little dresses, and she loved fashion. She loved clothes. And here he is with her on a sled. And this is another thing that Rosemary found very difficult to do, was to steer a sled on a snowy hillside. She found it very difficult to sail a boat. And as you know, the Kennedy children were famous for their sailing. And when they eventually got a home in Hyannisport, all the children took sailing lessons. They all participated in sailing races. They always won. And but Rosemary had a very difficult time figuring out how to work the sail and the rudder and all of that. It was very, very difficult for her. Tennis was difficult for her. She was very, she was not coordinated, and it was hard for her. So, but the Kennedy kids just you know, they were a clan, they were a group, and they were very physically active. I love these pictures here. These pictures, I think, were taken in Cohasset. They summered there before they bought their home in Hyannisport. And the kids were always together, always played together. Joe and Rose had a rule. They had a fundamental belief in the meaning of family. And they raised their children to be each other's best friend, protector, um, educator. And so this really played out very definitely in their family. So the older children taught the younger children sports, helped them with their coursework. They guided them, they protected them, they watched out for each other. And as you, some of you may know about the Kennedy family, even today, they are very protective of each other. They watch out for each other. And this goes back to Joe and Rose raising their children to be each other's best friends and to watch out for each other. So in the boat is Rosemary here on the left, the right-hand side. And I think Kick is right next to her. There's Joe in the middle, Jack at the bow of the boat with Eunice. And in the photograph on the right, I love this photograph. The children are with Joe. And he was very, very busy and he traveled a lot. So he wasn't home all the time. Rose had control of raising the children, basically, along with nurses and governesses. But Joe loved his children so much and he loved being around them. And so when he was with them, he was very, very present. And they loved him deeply, deeply. He was the fun parent. Rose was more of the disciplinarian, but Joe, he could afford to be the fun parent because he wasn't around all the time. So here he is on the beach with Rosemary and Jack, Eunice and Kick. And they loved him. And in the letters at the Kennedy Library, which is where I did a great majority of my research, the family papers, the children would write to their father, Joe, and they'd say, "Dear Daddy, I love you so much, Daddy. I'm doing this, I'm doing that." The letters are very free and loving. And the letters that they wrote to Rose are much more formal. And it would be, "Dear Mother, I am doing this, I am doing that." And then they would sign it, you know, "Your loving son, Robert," or, you know, Edward. So it was much more of a formal relationship with their mother. That doesn't mean that Rose didn't love her children. She absolutely did. But the way they parented was different. And the kids just were very affectionate with their father. So Rosemary was in this cocoon, in a sense, in the family. And of course, Joe and Rose had more children. After Eunice came Patricia in 1924, Bobby in 1925, Jean in 1928, and Teddy in 1932. So by the time Rosemary's 5 years old, and that's, you know, about 1923, she's enrolled at the Edward Devereaux School in Brookline in the kindergarten class. And she struggled in school. She was delayed in her abilities, and the teachers noticed it right away. And they worked with Joe and Rose, and they expressed their concern that Rosemary was delayed compared to her cohort. And Brookline, interestingly, was one of the first cities in the country to start giving their students the IQ test, which was developed during World War I. And they started instituting this test in the school system, and it determined that Rosemary had a low IQ. I do not know what the score was. I can't locate, or I wasn't able to locate those scores for Edward Devereaux School at the time that Rosemary was there, whereas other schools, I could find those records, but not for this one. But Rose wrote about this, that Rosemary had a low IQ. And back in those days, the teachers didn't have training in how to teach children with different abilities, with intellectual disabilities, different learners. They didn't have training in that, and they didn't have special needs teachers or different classrooms for children who needed extra help. So the teachers kept Rosemary back at least once in kindergarten, perhaps even twice. It's not really clear. In the meantime, Kik and Eunice come into kindergarten, and they're right along with their peers. As a matter of fact, Eunice is just, exceeding all of her peers. And Rosemary is slowly going on. So it was obvious that she had learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. It was more, it's like some people have said, oh, she had dyslexia. It was far more than that. It was a distinct learning disabilities. And so in my research, I realized that there was an important thing that happened during Rosemary's childbirth. Rose went into labor in September of 1918. It was when the Spanish flu, which we've been hearing about in the news in the past 2.5 years, was raging across the globe, and it had struck in Boston, and it was killing thousands of people. It killed millions of people around the world. It was killing thousands of people in Boston, and tens of thousands of people were very, very sick. Rose went into labor in September in the middle of this pandemic, and she called for the doctor. And she had a nurse living with them at the time in anticipation of Rose going into labor and giving birth at home. And this nurse had been trained in obstetrical care through her nursing program. And so they called the doctor, Dr. Frederick Good, and he was busy at the hospital with all these sick patients that were sick with the flu. So the nurse was told to kind of make Rose comfortable, and she had been trained to delay the birth as long as possible so that the doctor could deliver the baby. So she tried to make Rose comfortable, but the labor pains are coming on faster and more furious. She'd already delivered twice before. The labor was progressing quite quickly. So the nurse had her cross her legs so that she would stop, she wouldn't push. She told Rose, don't push on those contractions. And then when that didn't work, she held Rose's legs together. And when that didn't work, she held baby Rosemary, who was coming down the birth canal. She held the baby back in the birth canal for what was estimated for 2 hours until Frederick Good could arrive to deliver the baby, which he did do. He arrived, he delivered the baby. Everyone's happy. It's okay. That delay in the delivery, I believe, may have caused little Rosemary to be deprived of oxygen and therefore had intellectual disabilities. I don't know for sure, but Rose talked about this much later in her life, this phenomenon that happened. And in over the years, I have met women who describe this happening to them in the 1950s, 1960s. Women have approached me and said that happened to my mother, and my sibling is disabled because of it. And it wasn't until the 1970s that they kind of figured out this is not a good practice. You don't delay the birth of a baby, that could cause severe damage. So whether that happened or not and caused her disability, I don't know, but the fact that it happened is in the historical record, and that is, I point that to her disabilities. So Rosemary struggled in school. The family picks up and they leave Boston and they move to New York, where Joe is becoming more and more involved in the financial industry. And so they buy a home there outside of New York City, and Rose enrolls the children in local public schools and the older boys in private schools. And Rosemary just kind of goes along, and she's in the same grades with her younger sisters, and she just is not progressing at all, and it's becoming very, very difficult. So when she was 11 years old in 1929, they made the decision to send her to a private school outside of Philadelphia called the Devereaux School, which was established by a woman by the name of Devereaux, who specialized in children with learning disabilities. But it was a boarding school, and so this was going to be a traumatic moment for Rosemary, that she goes off to this school away from her family, this cocoon, this world that she feels safe and secure in. And so it's very, very difficult for her. She's lonely, she's frightened, she's angry. And the school has two rules. One is you have to behave, and two is you have to do well in your studies, or you can't go home for Thanksgiving. And Rosemary, it's such a cruel thing to do anyway, but she's struggling because she wants to do well and she wants to be able to go home to see her family. These pictures are of Rosemary. I think the one on the left, she's probably 13 years old or so. Lovely young teenage girl. The one on the right is Rosemary. She's a little bit younger, probably 10 or 11, about the time that she was sent to Devereaux. You see her on the beach in Hyannisport, and she's reading a Hollywood, sort of a Hollywood Reporter or Hollywood Variety magazine about all the stars, the movies, the movie stars, fashion. Of course, her father by this time is involved in movies, and there are movie stars coming in and out of their home. So she can read. It's about a third grade level. And she can write with difficulty, but she can write. But she enjoyed reading about movie stars. She loved movies. She loved fashion and clothes, etc. She was like a typical girl, but she had these learning disabilities as well. Her happiest times were when she was with her family. This photograph, I just love it. Rosemary is just so happy to be with her family. This photograph was taken in the summer of 1932. Rose is, or of 1931, excuse me, the summer of 1931. Rose is pregnant with Teddy, and all the children are there. It's Bobby and Jack and Kick and Jean. There's Joe and Rose and Patricia. There is Kick and Rosemary and Joe behind her. And it just shows you how Rosemary loved to be with her family. But the tragedy is, so she's at the Devereaux School, and she writes home to her father, many letters to her father. It was always to her father, dear Daddy, I love you. Guess what, Daddy? I'm doing so well in school. I'm getting A's and everything. This is what she's writing to him. In the meantime, she doesn't know. So she says in these letters, I'm doing really well. I'm behaving. I'm getting A's in all my classes. Please tell Mrs. Devereaux that I can come home for Thanksgiving. What she doesn't know that is her teachers are sending letters to Joe and Rose saying Rosemary's acting out, she's misbehaving, and she's not doing well in her classes. And it is so tragic because it was, while I understood the good intentions of Joe and Rose, it was not a good fit for Rosemary. She was emotionally immature. She couldn't handle being away from her family, that cocoon that she felt so safe and nurtured in. This is a sample of one of her letters. This is from 1934, so she's 16 years old. Now, from the time she was 11 till she was 18, she was sent to 5 different schools in hopes that each school could do better for her. So here she is, 16 years old. This is a letter that she wrote, Dear Daddy. She obviously had seen him recently. I know that this letter took her several tries to make. She usually had some aide or somebody helping her. They would have given her lined paper to put underneath this note paper so that she would follow the faint lines, so she would write straight across, because she had a tendency to actually write up from the bottom of the page, sort of in an arc up to the top of the page. She had a very difficult time figuring out where punctuation went, what she should capitalize, what she shouldn't. Just basic grammar was very difficult for her. As you can see, some of that is here, but she was very, it was just hit or miss for her for these letters. And this happened to be a very good one because obviously someone helped her with it. But she was very, very sad going to all these different schools. So after the special school in Philadelphia, Joe and Rose decided to enroll her in regular private schools. Some of them were Sacred Heart Catholic School academies. Others were other private schools for average and gifted children. And Joe and Rose began to sort of not tell the truth about Rosemary's record and what her abilities were. And there are letters in the Kennedy Library. Some of the administrators and teachers from some of these schools would write to Joe and Rose and basically say, you didn't tell us that your daughter had these difficulties. We're having a difficult time with her. She's acting out. We don't have the resources. We don't have the teachers that can teach her. So they were a little duplicitous in their way of trying to handle taking care of Rosemary. Rose was off doing many of her things. Joe was very busy with his businesses, going back and forth to California and New York, and Rose was going to Europe. And they just wanted somebody to take care of Rosemary and help educate her in whatever way was possible. And it wasn't going very smoothly, unfortunately. And she suffered greatly. But in 1938, Joe, who had been working for the federal government for FDR, he was first chairman of the Securities Commission, and was changing the laws related to Wall Street because he made a bundle in the stock market and he knew the foibles and pitfalls of the stock market and how it can be abused. So he was part of making laws to prevent that from happening again. And then FDR, in sort of payback to thank him for all the work that he had done, he appointed Joe as ambassador to Great Britain. This was a huge moment for the family. Joe would be the first Irish American appointed to that position in London. And Rose, of course, was thrilled because Rose was a political being at heart. She grew up in a political household. She was her father's sort of right-hand man as he was campaigning all those years before, and she would go to all the events and to the speeches. She loved politics. So for her husband to have this position was just amazing for her. So she and Joe decided that they would bring all the children over to London because it would be a great opportunity for them to meet the great leaders of the world, the great thinkers, authors, artists, all these amazing worldly people they could meet in London. So throughout the late winter and early spring of 1938, they brought all the children over sort of two at a time. They believed in not having the whole family travel together because if there was a plane crash or a train crash or whatever, they wanted to be sure that somebody survived. So everybody traveled separately in smaller groups. Rosemary was the last to be brought over to London, and she traveled with Eunice on a boat with Mary and Eddie Moore. And the press was all there when they launched on the ship in New York City. The Kennedys were always in the news. They were a part of newsreels and in magazines. They were very, very famous at the time. And there's some, news footage of Rosemary saying goodbye to everybody. She had been trained not to talk to people in public, but she had a beautiful smile, so she could wave and say goodbye and thank you. And yes, I'm very happy, that kind of stuff. So here she is with Eunice in 1938. Eunice is 17 years old in this picture. So, and Kik went over too. She's 18 years old, 20 years old, and 18 years old, and she has just graduated from high school. And so this is going to be really a great time for her. And Kik was quite pretty too. I view this photograph. This photograph is taken of the whole Kennedy family at the ambassador's residence in London. And it just captured this most magical time for the family. They were the happiest. Joe's career, political aspirations, he had many, and the boys were getting older and their dreams for these successful sons, everything was coming into fruition. Rose could be the ambassador's wife, and it was just an amazing moment. And this picture is just beautiful. So I'll go through from left to right. There's Eunice and Jack and Rosemary. There's Jean and there's Joe and there's Teddy little Teddy, he's 6 years old, Rose and Joe and Patricia and Bobby and Kick. It's a great picture. And there are actually news footage, BBC news footage of them. They're walking across the lawn and to the photographers. And there are many photographers there taking their pictures. So they arrive, Rosemary arrives in late April with Eunice, and Kick has already arrived. And it was the debutante season in London. And Rose was determined that her daughters they would come out and have their debut in London. And the debutante season involved being presented to the King and Queen of England. And it's this very serious event. You have to wear clothes a certain way, and your gloves and posies, of course, your flowers that you hold, everything has to be done perfectly. And so they had to prepare the girls. So it was Kick and Rosemary who were going to be presented first. That's May of 1938. Rose bought the girls these magnificent designer gowns. And there's Rosemary right there. You can see how beautiful she looks in the formal picture down below. I mean, the formal one with all the three of them together. And then Rosemary looking at the photographer with that beautiful smile. So there are rules and conduct that you have to know before you go through this whole debutante thing and you meet the king and queen, and you have to curtsy a certain way. There are certain words you have to say. So Kick practiced a couple hours, she got it down, but it took a couple of weeks to teach Rosemary the curtsy, the things to say, and all of that, so she didn't get nervous, she didn't forget. So all the photographers loved Rosemary because she seemed a little bit mysterious because she didn't talk much, but she was so beautiful. And you can see that smile and the way she looked. It was like she's got this kind of impish look, but she's beautiful. And the photographers, and in this photograph, you can't see it, but there are like 3 or 4 more rows of photographers there taking pictures of them. So they go to the event, they're presented to the king and queen, and everybody holds their breath as Rosemary goes to curtsy. She stumbles a tiny bit, but she catches herself, beautiful, does whatever she needs to do, and it's a complete success. The next day in the press, they raved about Rosemary, how beautiful she was, her dress, her smile, everything. They had a little bit about Kick, and then they criticized Rose because Rose wore a white dress with silver flowers on it. And married women were not supposed to wear white, any white, in front of the king and queen. Only unmarried women could. And so in Rose's diary, she writes about how furious she is that people criticized her for wearing that beautiful designer gown. She didn't acknowledge that she made a mistake. She wasn't supposed to wear white. And she was angry because the press paid more attention to Rosemary than to Kick. It just made me so sad because Rosemary was just so beautiful and lovely. And I'm glad she had her moment that day. So the children spent a lot of time traveling around Europe. The cover photo of my book, and that was the beginning of this this presentation, was a picture of Rosemary in Ireland. This is another photograph of her at the same day. She's on a train or in a waiting room in a train station or something. But she's just stunning, and people were so attracted to her. I learned later on, after my book came out, a journalist from Ireland contacted me, and he told me that his aunt had been hired by the Kennedys to accompany Rosemary as she toured Ireland that summer and fall of 1938. And he sent me letters that were sent back and forth between this man's aunt as a young woman and Rosemary and her family. It was really sweet. I wish I had seen them before I wrote my book, but it was really very sweet to know that the Kennedys always hired somebody to accompany Rosemary. Even if she traveled with the family, she always had a companion that would, about her age, that would, work with her and be like her friend wherever they traveled. Here's a picture of them in Pompeii, Italy. They traveled everywhere. They even met the Pope. And this one is, I find very funny. So they're in Pompeii. The press follow them all through Europe. They're reporting on them everywhere. And there's news footage at the Kennedy Library, BBC news footage. Obviously, they played in movie theaters and things like that. And so the grouping here, they're walking up this cobblestone roadway in Pompeii or somewhere near there. And there's little Teddy, and he's a politician even then. He's waving at the reporters and saying, "Hey, how you doing? Nice to see you all." He's so cute. Even at 6 years old, he knew how to work a crowd. But they always had to control Rosemary. They always had to be on top of where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. And you can see in this picture on the left, she's at an event at the ambassador's residence. Her father is kind of gripping her hand. Eddie Moore is sitting with her at dinner. They tried to watch to make sure that young men didn't approach her. And she was very attracted to young men. Her brothers always filled her dance card. Their special friends that knew about Rosemary would dance with her, fill her dance card. And in a couple of letters that she wrote, she expressed frustration that her brothers and their friends were always dancing with her. She wanted to dance with other young men, that she liked other young men, but the family was very much trying to control her. They were afraid that someone would capture her attention and take her away or expose her disabilities to the world. In the meantime, Kik and her brothers were having a ball in London. They were invited everywhere. Every Duke and Duchess wanted them at their home, at their parties, at their country estates, at the races. And then poor Rosemary had to go to like the opening of a zoo with her father, and she resented that. And by the way, you can see this picture of Rosemary with her father, and he's gripping her again. It's like an unnatural kind of holding her and controlling her. It was very hard for her. But they enrolled her in a finishing school, trying to keep her busy, but the finishing school rejected her after 3 weeks. They said, "We can't deal with Rosemary." There was an Assumption Academy school in London that they enrolled Teddy and Bobby in. And the Mother Superior also had a women's school or a girls' school that was attached to the Assumption Catholic Academy. Her name was Mother Isabel Eugenie, and she had been trained by Maria Montessori in Italy, and that's how she taught students in her academies. So she agreed to take Rosemary into the academy and train her as a teacher, or to at least keep her occupied every day. And she told Rosemary that she was training her to be a preschool teacher aide. And Rosemary was thrilled. And this is when Rosemary blossomed, because Mother Isabel used those Montessori methods to engage Rosemary and gave her the tools that she needed to learn. And Rosemary literally blossomed. And she did simple things like it was a boarding school, and the girls would help with dishes afterwards. So she would have Rosemary count the silverware after they finished washing it and they dried it to put it away. Simple things like that. And Rosemary felt greatly fulfilled. And of course, she was very good as a preschool teacher's aide, because she could read, particularly to little children. So it was a really good time for Rosemary. She felt very, very successful and proud. These are pictures of Mother Isabel. She moved to the United States after World War II and moved to Connecticut and ran Assumption schools there and elsewhere. And I put these pictures here because one of these they're in my book. The lower photograph of the children walking and the little girls, and the little girl on the far right who is praying as she's walking, that little girl is now a grown woman, and she lives in LA, and she contacted me after my book came out, and she told me that she went to that school and she had dyslexia and she struggled with learning, but under Mother Isabel Eugenie's tutelage, she learned to read and write and become incredibly successful, and she is a special needs teacher now in LA. So I thought, what a tremendous legacy that Mother Isabel Eugenie left, not only for Rosemary, but for this woman as well. So World War II arrives the Nazis are marching across Europe. It's getting very threatening. So in the fall of 1939, Rose and Joe decide that the family is going to return to America. Joe has to stay behind because he's the ambassador. And they decide to leave Rosemary too because she's so happy. And so everyone else leaves. But by the winter of 1940, you know, the Nazis are getting ready to march into France, which they do in May. And so she's there. They have to move Rosemary back to the United States. Rosemary is devastated. She doesn't want to go, but it's too dangerous. Mother Isabel has moved the school into the countryside because it's too dangerous with the bombings happening in London. So these are pictures of Rosemary with Eddie and Mary Moore, who stay behind to kind of monitor that, make sure that Rosemary's okay, and to keep taking care of Joe and helping him with his work. So by June 1st, Rosemary is back in the United States, and this is when things begin to take a bad turn for her. Rose is frustrated because she doesn't know how really to take care of Rosemary anymore. Rosemary by 1940 is 22 years old, and she's difficult to handle when she doesn't get her way. And Rose hasn't been taking care of Rosemary all those years, and Joe is still in London. So she makes arrangements for Rosemary to go to a camp in the summer in Massachusetts. She contacts the daughter of a judge that knew her father, Honey Fitz, and they ran a Catholic summer camp for girls, and the Sullivan sisters, and she contacted the Sullivan girls and said, please hire my daughter Rosemary as a junior counselor at your camp for the summer. She's been trained to work with young children. This will be perfect. And the Sullivan girls are like, of course, Mrs. Kennedy, this is a great idea, Mrs. Kennedy. Of course we'll hire her. Rosemary arrives, and within a couple days, the Sullivan sisters realize, Rosemary is not capable of being a junior counselor. She actually needs a counselor to be with her all the time. She wanders off in the woods. She goes off in the middle of the night and wanders away, and they just can't cope. They call Rose, say, you've got to come get Rosemary. Rose says no. So for 3 weeks, they are trying to convince Rose or somebody to come and get Rosemary. Eventually, Eddie Moore, who has traveled back to the United States with Rosemary, goes and gets her and installs her at another Assumption Academy in Philadelphia, thinking the Assumption nuns will treat her the same way that Mother Isabel did in London. But that didn't work very easily. Here's a letter of Rosemary's writing to the Sullivan sisters, just crying how upset she is. She had to leave the camp. She doesn't understand what she did wrong, and she doesn't want to disappoint her father, but she'll do whatever they tell her to do, but she's confused about why she had to leave. It's very tragic. Eventually, Joe brings her to Washington, D.C. FDR, pulls him from the ambassador's residence back to DC because, Joe is just not doing a good job. He's not, I'm not even going to go into that, but you can read about it in the book. And he brings Rosemary to a convent in Washington, D.C. She runs away from the convent. She sneaks out at night. The nuns go out looking for her. They find her at 2 o'clock in the morning. She's been drinking. She's got leaves in her hair. Everyone's afraid the worst could happen. She's going to meet someone. She's going to get pregnant. Who knows what they were afraid of, but they were afraid. So Joe hears about the experimental prefrontal lobotomy going on at George Washington University Hospital. Dr. Walter Freeman and James Watts are conducting these experiments on patients, and they're telling the world that it is the best procedure ever. It restores people to full and happy lives, and they can function independently. This is what they're telling the world, but their private research, the outcome was not that way. Very few people came out of the surgery able to live fully independent, happy lives. Many of them needed to be institutionalized. 16% of them died. But Joe insisted that this would happen. He talked to Rose about it. She talked to Kik. Kik investigated, said, Mom, the results just are not good. I don't recommend that you do this for Rosemary. I don't know what Rose said to Joe, but from what Rose seems to have said to him, no, this isn't a great idea. He disagreed. He went and had her lobotomized. In November of 1941, she was lobotomized. And when she came out of the surgery, she could not walk or talk. She was incontinent. and they had to put her in Joe put her in the Craig Hospital in Beacon, New York, which was a psychiatric hospital. And there she languished for 8 years. Rose, by the way, sort of excised Rosemary from their lives. None of her letters from then forward for 20 years mentioned Rosemary, none of them. In 1949, Joe moved Rosemary to St. Coletta's School in Jefferson, Wisconsin, which specialized in the care of children with intellectual disabilities. And they built a cottage for her. She moved there in 1949, and that is where she lived until she died in 2005. The nuns took very good care of her there. She had friends. She got physical therapy so that she could walk. She could talk a little bit again. And the Kennedys, built an Olympic-sized pool for her to swim in every day. She was a very strong woman, despite all of the physical disabilities as a result of the surgery. In the meantime, the kids were not told what happened to Rosemary, just that she was gone away. But in the 1950s, when Jack Kennedy was on the campaign trail in 1958, he went to Jefferson, Wisconsin, and he went to see Rosemary, and it shocked him what he found. And Eunice, of course, heard what was going on. So when he became president and Eunice had his ear, they started right away helping support legislation to create funding resources for communities, for National Institute of Health, to create, to fund research into maternal and child health, pregnancy, and for resources for families with children with disabilities. And this is a picture of Jack signing some legislation just in October of 1963 before he was assassinated. It was really important that these siblings understood that they needed to make a change because of what happened to Rosemary. And in 1962, an article came out in the Saturday Evening Post about Rosemary being born with intellectual disabilities. It did not disclose that she had a lobotomy, but they told the world that she had intellectual disabilities. And as a result of that, Rose finally went to visit Rosemary in 1962, and the nuns there reported that Rosemary saw her mother, yelled, and hit her. She was so angry. She never forgot who she was and who her family was, but her mother didn't visit her for more than 20 years. But Rose got out in front of it and helped raise money for building new institutes and research centers. That's a tremendous legacy today. Joe Kennedy suffered a stroke in 1961. He could not walk or talk until he died in 68 or 69. And after that, Rose started bringing Rosemary home 1 week in Hyannisport and 1 week in Palm Beach, where she got to know her siblings again, and also to meet her nieces and nephews. She had many of them who loved her very, very much. And one in particular that particularly loved her, it was Anthony Shriver, Eunice Kennedy Shriver's son, who runs Best Buddies program. And he would go to St. Coletta's and he would stay with his aunt. He'd sleep on the floor in her bungalow. And when he got married and started raising his family in Miami, he built an addition to his home so Rosemary could come visit with the nuns that would take care of her. He was very, very close to her. And he sent me these pictures that I could use in my book. So the sum of it is, Rosemary's siblings were profoundly affected by her, and it defined who they became as adults. And of course, Eunice helps establish the Special Olympics. She knew that, families with children with disabilities had gifts, and that they, let's celebrate that and bring it out into the world. Jean Kennedy Smith started Very Special Arts, which is a program for children with disabilities. And of course, Senator Ted Kennedy, over the 40 years of his political career, was a part of hundreds of pieces of legislation to help improve the lives of people with disabilities and their families, including the Disability Act, that we all have to have accessibility in in public spaces today because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a direct result of being raised with a sister who had disabilities and what happened to her. And this is Best Buddies, which here in Massachusetts, they have the big challenge, the bike ride that raises money every year for Best Buddies at Hyannisport. So even though it's a tragic story, Rosemary lived an amazing life with a family that loved her deeply, and she affected her siblings who would go on and change the world because of her. And so her legacy is we live in a better nation and a better world because of Rosemary. So I'm going to stop the share and see if there are questions that I can answer now. And I hope you enjoy learning about Rosemary. There we go.
Thank you so much. So Myra made a couple of comments that Rosemary looks so much like Bobby, and that she too went to the Edward Devotion School. She asked the question, what was the behavior that the schools couldn't deal with? And I believe that she asked this question right after you mentioned the finishing school.
So Rosemary, even as a child, she would strike out at when there was a lot of activity going on or she didn't get her way, she would strike out physically and hurt people, her siblings, or there's one instance where she beat on her grandfather at one point, and it shocked everybody. And as she became a teenager and then the hormones start, her behavior became very erratic. She may have had several different things going. She may have been bipolar as she became more of an adult, because she would have these incredible mood swings and really lash out at people. It was quite frightening. So when she was doing this in schools, the schools are like, hey, we're not prepared to deal with a girl that's throwing things around and hitting people. This is, you know, why didn't you tell us? So that was what was happening. And some doctors in the 1930s, when she was early to mid-teens, they were trying to medicate her. One doctor said to the Kennedys, oh, I can cure her of this. And he gave her hormone treatments. She'd go in for shots every week. I don't know what hormones he was giving her, but I can't imagine giving that to a young teenage girl, which probably just exacerbated whatever was going on in her life. It was just experimenting on her even then. So she had tremendous mood swings and physical altercations with people.
Paulette asked, where was Jack? Now she asked this question right after you showed the picture of the Kennedys in Ireland walking arm in arm.
Yeah. So Jack was, of course, like 18, 19 months older. So Jack and Joe were off in doing other things, and he was, you know, they were grooming him for politics, just like they were grooming Joe for politics. And he was dating older women. And of course, they looked after their younger sister, but she was really, so she was intellectually disabled and very immature. And so they had their own lives. So they liked hanging out with Kik. She was fun, she was vivacious, but Rosemary was difficult. When they were younger and they were in boarding schools, as in high school, and even when they were in college, and they would get Rosemary out of the boarding school she was at, and they would take her dancing to make her feel good. So they were good brothers, but they couldn't always be there. They had lives that they were trying to live as young men.
Patricia asked, did any of the children ever try to bring Rosemary home?
So Eunice did a lot. So Eunice was right out there. So she brought Rosemary to her home in Chicago and outside of Washington, D.C. Rose was the one that was hesitant until Joe died. And then she felt free to be able to bring Rosemary home for the 2 weeks a year. And it was very difficult on Rose. I mean, people wrote about observing how Rosemary maintained her anger towards her mother, and it pained Rose so much. She just didn't know what to do and how to behave. But all the siblings, not all the siblings, but some of the siblings, and of course, all of those nieces and nephews just brought great joy to Rosemary. And that was the highlight of her vacations with the family.
Tony said that growing up, that she was told that Joe never told Rose that the lobotomy was going to happen. And do you
Yeah, that's
know?
not true. He did discuss it with Rose, who in turn discussed it with Kik. So the family was aware, and Rose at some point wrote that she did not agree with it, but Joe went ahead and did it anyway. So, and Rose was that type of woman. She had to move on. She had all these other children and aspirations for her sons. So she just put that in a pocket. Rosemary was going to be taken care of away from the family. And that was the end of it after the Rosemary. After the lobotomy. I'm sure Rose was furious, but she just went on and lived her life like she always did.
Diana wants to know, why did the mother never visit her? Did
Uh,
she give a reason?
she never gave a reason, and this is so I have sympathy for Joe and Rose not understanding or figuring out where the resources were or what to do with Rosemary. But how could Rose not see her daughter for 20 years? How is that possible? And I'm not sure if Joe ever saw her again. He may have gone to visit her at the Craig house. He may have, though I doubt it. So Eddie and Mary Moore went and visited Rosemary at the Craig house in Beacon, New York, and then at St. Coletta's until they died. So Joe, I'm not so sure if he ever saw her again. And Rose, I can't forgive her mother that never does that. I can't get my head around that.
So Anne asks, was there ever any mention of medication for her, or was there any available at that time?
So this is before medications like Valium or any sort of drugs that they would give for someone today with mental health issues like bipolar disorder, et cetera, or depression or manic. So they didn't have those drugs. The only thing were barbiturates, which I believe they did give to Rosemary during the 1930s on occasion. And Eunice remembered that as a child, Rosemary having seizures. And so Eunice wasn't clear, didn't understand what that was all about, except when that would happen, the doctor would come and give her little red pills. Well, in the 1930s, those little red pills were barbiturates. So that's the only thing that I know that they gave her, aside from the hormone shots, whatever those were.
And Patricia asked, and I think I'm understanding the question now. Do they know what happened to Rosemary to make her act out and be so violent? Was that?
They didn't understand it. And I think that's why I think it wasn't just intellectual disabilities. It was something else that was going on too. I think she had some mental health issues, and those really emerged when she was a teenager. So, and which is typical of some of these mental health issues, they emerge in teenagehood. So I'm imagining that's what happened with Rosemary. But at the time, they wouldn't know how to even deal with that. And then she's intellectually disabled at the same time. And Joe was so desperate to find a cure. He wanted a cure. And all these doctors promised a cure, and all they did was just, I think, make it worse.
The questions have stopped coming, but, oh, wait. Oh, okay. So Susan wants to know, what drove you to write the book?
So, as a Bostonian, I grew up in New England, and so I had always known the Kennedys. We all know the Kennedys. And I knew about the family. I knew about Rosemary, not that much, because not much was written about her before. And in 2005, when she died in January, there was an obituary in the Boston Globe, and I read it. And I thought, and it was a beautiful photograph of her, and then 3 paragraphs. And I thought, oh, that's so sad. Well, I need to know more. And I thought, well, I'll go to the Kennedy Library because it's right down the road, and I'll write an article about her. So I was working on another book at the time. I finished that book, and in 2008, I went to the JFK Library to see what I could find about Rosemary and write that article. And as I arrived, they had just started opening Rose Kennedy's papers, her journals, her diaries, some of the family letters. And when I saw that stuff and I saw Rosemary's own letters, I knew I could write a book because I had a little bit of Rosemary's voice, and I just had confidence in my ability as a women's historian that I could figure this story out. And it took a long time, but yeah, I did it. But that's what drove me, that obituary and wanting to know a little bit more.
Tony was wondering if you ever spoke with Caroline Kennedy while you were writing the book.
So a lot of Kennedys would not speak to me. You know, that's typical. Anthony Shriver and his brother Tim Shriver both granted me interviews. They were fabulous and wonderful. And they both basically said that the siblings, any of them, they don't really reflect on the family much. And Anthony was very honest, said, we don't really know much about what happened to Rosemary because no one ever talked about it. And so he told me he was looking forward to finding out. So that was the truth. So, you know, there you go. Maybe someone else knew more, but, you know, no one else was talking. And I remember Ted Kennedy, he passed away, and so did Eunice before I could interview them if they were willing to be interviewed. But he wrote in his memoir that he was 9 years old when Rosemary disappeared from the family. And he said in his memoir that at the time he thought he'd better behave or he might disappear too.
Were there any other indications of mental illness in any of the other Kennedy children? That question is from Patricia.
So I didn't see that in any of the others, but I didn't study their lives, and maybe someone else would disagree who has studied the lives of the other siblings. However, I know that Patrick Kennedy came out with a book. It was released a day before mine in 2015, and his was a book about struggling with mental health issues and addiction. And he talks about that as an issue in the family, but he's much better to discuss it than me because I did not research that part of the family. And he's devoted himself to mental health issues in the family.
And Susan wants to know, what are you working on now?
Oh, I haven't decided. I haven't decided. There are so many women to write about out there, but I haven't decided yet.
So we'll stay tuned. Over and over again, people have been putting into chat what a wonderful presentation and thanking you. And I think it might be appropriate to mention once again that if people have the book or want to obtain a copy, they can bring it to the library by February 5th. And we'll arrange for Kate to sign it, but don't forget to put a bookmark in it, letting me know whose book it is and a telephone number and the person that you want it inscribed to. Kate, thank you so much. But before I give you my final thank you, I want to thank the Friends of the Burlington Library for supporting this program. But Kate, this was wonderful. I love that book. And,
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks
This was
so
great.
much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everybody.